In the previous screen, I pointed out that we were going to have to tag and block on the OSPF so that the external of 150 didn't remove an ISIS 160 from the table. But of course, we've actually dropped that external down to 13. So although that's true, we're going to have to tag and block for an entire host of reasons here, because the 13 will remove all sorts of routes. Okay, so what we're looking at here is kind of an overview so we can get a summary of what's going on. There's a lot of protocols. Here we have effectively triple redistribution points because these routers here are running the RIP, the OSPF and the ISIS, and they're redistributing between them. So in summary, to sort of clean this up, what we're really doing here is the bounce back from the OSPF is being tagged and blocked. And the bounce back from the RIP is also being tagged and blocked. And in a later example, we'll see that rather than tagging and blocking, we're just going to list the routes and block them explicitly. But the principle's the same. It's the ISIS that's different. We're trying to prevent an import filter on the ISIS, which as we know is possible today, but generally bad practice. So to prevent that import filter, we're setting admin distance so that none of the imports from the ISIS will cause trouble on the other protocols. And that is why the OSPF is going lower than the ISIS of 15, sort of best case scenario, and why the RIP is going lower than the ISIS of 15. That's the summary. Tag and block on the OSPF, tag and block on the RIP, and then set the values inside the table for the OSPF and the RIP, not as part of the block coming in. This 14 isn't set so that the bounce back from RIP is different. And this 13 in OSPF hasn't been set so that the bounce back from OSPF does something different. This 13 and 14 have been set so that the bounce back from ISIS can't remove these routes. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves how wide area metrics had changed this. And let's remind ourselves about how IP version 6 had also had an impact. So our summary stays the same, but let's look again at what happened. Because we're running wide area metrics only, the externals that are bouncing back from ISIS actually bounce back with a preference of 15, not the 160. And that's why this 15 has been quite prevalent in this example. And it's increased the issue with these values in the table. The second point is, how did IP version 6 have an impact on this? Well, we're wide area metrics only here in the ISIS. And on IP version 6, it can mark the external marker in the TLV. And that means that an IP version 6 route that's coming back from OSPF version 3, it will actually carry the 160, not the 15. And so if you remember, on the OSPF, on the external, there's the external for version 4 and the external for version 6. We moved them both down to 13 for symmetry. But of course, the external version 6 at 150 would come back from ISIS at 160, and of course the 150 would be safe. So we moved them for symmetry. And that's how wide area metrics has had an impact on this. It's because the wide area metrics only affect the ISIS, and they specifically affect the ISIS bounce back because they affect the ISIS externals, and it's the externals that will always bounce back. You can have a route in the table, and as you export it out of ISIS, it's going to bounce back with the external value. So just a final comment about the aggregate routes. Of course, the aggregate route is representing the ISIS, but it's an aggregate route, not ISIS itself. And the reason for this, as we know, is that because the ISIS doesn't actually create a default route inside a level 1, it sets the attached bit on the ABRs, and then each router inside level 1 creates their own default route towards the ABR. Of course, you can't export that, and we wanted to export the ISIS summary into RIP, and so we put on the aggregate route to do that. Of course, the RIP is just running version 4, so there's only an aggregate route for version 4 in this particular example, and of course it has the value of 130 as a preference prior to being exported out.